Now that we've created our SharePoint search environment, it's time to turn our attention to getting in and configuring it. Now there's going to be two sides to configuring SharePoint search. The first side is going to be getting everything set up behind the scenes. The second side is going to be getting everything set up for our users. Now we're going to take a look at how to get everything set up for our users in a later lesson. Right now we want to focus in on getting everything set up behind the scenes. Now, one of the biggest things that you probably noticed from the little create screen for setting up our SharePoint search implementation is the fact that it really doesn't ask us any questions at all. About the only thing that it asks us is just simply the service application information, and that's it. It then goes off and creates all the databases and all the different components and everything else automatically for us, which to a certain extent I suppose is okay. I mean, it's nice that it goes off and takes care of that for us. The problem, however, is the fact that it's going to be setting everything up with an awful lot of default values that we might not necessarily want. So quite frequently, you're going to need to go back and change everything inside of your SharePoint architecture. This is, unfortunately, where part of the challenge comes into place. That we've got a lot of different components. You're going to notice that when we go in and we create that service application, that it just goes off and sets up the defaults. There is really no UI for going in and setting up all the different components inside of SharePoint Search. That the only way that you're going to be able to do this is by utilizing PowerShell. Now, the nice part is that we do have a full suite of PowerShell commandlets that are available to us. So when we want to connect to our service application, we're just simply going to call get SP Enterprise Search Topology. When we want to create a brand new admin component, a brand new crawl component, or a brand new index component, what we're going to see is that we've got the appropriate commandlets for managing all of that as well. And if you want to go in and modify any of the values, if you want to go in and remove anything, you have commandlets for that as well. What I want to take a look at for my little example here is how to move the index file from the default location to a better location, preferably off to a dedicated disk. Now, one of the best ways to manage this is by utilizing the mount point capability that NTFS brought to the table back in Windows 2000. And the nice part about doing that is that when I go in and I point to a particular location, it's not an actual folder path on the local system. What it is instead is a pointer to a drive. And then that way, I'll be able to move that around as needed behind the scenes, as long as, of course, the search component is stopped, without having to go back and reconfigure everything. Really, you just as a general rule, want to take advantage of mount points whenever you're talking about having to be concerned about the placement of almost anything inside of the file system. In the meantime, you're going to notice that there is no PowerShell commandlet for moving that index file from its default location. That default location is set during the installation. That when you do the install, it will ask you, hey, where do you want to put the index file? But chances are you probably long ago forgot where it was that you put it, and you might have even just left it with C:\\. In order to move the index file, the basic steps are to create a brand new index component, configure that index component to write the index file out to the new location, and then go back and delete the original component. So again, there is no true move. Basically, what you're going to wind up doing is creating a brand new replica, a brand new component, and then getting rid of the old one. Let's see how we could do this. So what I'm going to do to make my demo a little bit easier is I'm going to fire up my PowerShell ISE, and I'm going to open up my little script file here, and this will be my move index file. Okay. Now, inside of here, what I've got up at the very top is, again, the basic. I need to pull in the PowerShell commandlets, and that's what that top line is going to be doing. The second portion is to go get the current environment. Now, the couple of things that I want to highlight about the first couple of lines there, on line 4, You're going to notice that we're going to connect out to our service application. We do need to specify the name of the search service application. In my case, it's SharePoint Search. You might have given it a different name, so whatever name it is that you're using, that's the name that you have to provide. Then we're going to connect out to our instance, and we're going to do that by just simply calling get SP Enterprise Search Service Instance. If you want to connect to a different server, you can specify the server name here. In my case, because I'm using the local environment, it's just simply going to be tick local. And then down below, I'm going to go get that current search topology by calling the get SP Enterprise Search Topology and passing in our search application. Now, the next command is to create our brand new topology. And what you're going to notice on the topology is that we have the ability, I'm just going to scroll a little bit to the right here, to clone an existing environment. And that's exactly what we're doing here by calling tick clone and then passing in a couple of parameters to point to our current implementation. Like I said, our basic steps here is to create a brand new one, which is just going to be a copy of the existing, tell it where we want the index file to be created, and then we'll go back and do the cleanup. So the first part is going to be getting that set up. If I scroll back a little bit to the left here, you're going to notice that we're now going to create the brand new component. And if I scroll off to the right, the biggest thing that I want you to notice here is going to be that root directory. So that's where I'm going to identify where we want the index file to be. Now, in my case, I'm throwing it on to C:\index. I just have the local C drive on my VM, and that's it. But this could, again, very easily be a mapped path. So just because you say C:\index doesn't mean that it has to be on the C drive, that this could be off on another disk, preferably, that's going to be dedicated to just housing our index file. And then if I scroll back to the right, then what we're going to do is we're going to set that enterprise topology, which is basically just kind of the update or the save command to actually put that into there. And then the rest of this is just going in and doing our cleanup work, that we're going to go back, grab the original component, and remove that. And it just takes a couple of commands to go off and remove our existing environment. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go ahead and execute my script here. And we'll just give this a couple of moments. Okay, so now that our script is run, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to fire up my C drive here, and I'm going to go to index, and what I want you to notice inside of here is that this is now where our index is going to be placed. So we've now successfully moved our index location to another location in our hard drive system. Once all the behind-the-scenes information is set up, it's time to turn our attention to getting SharePoint to work, actually getting out, crawling our data, and getting it ready for our users to take a look at. And this is what we want to take a look at in this section, search configuration. Now, the first thing that we're going to be creating, or at least managing, inside of our SharePoint search implementation is our content sources. Our content sources allow us to tell SharePoint Search where to crawl. Now, we can create as many content sources as we might need, but the big thing to keep in mind is that each content source needs to have two things in common. They need to be the same type of location: Exchange public folders, file shares, SharePoint, and they all need to share the exact same schedule. Now, we're also going to see a little bit later that we can set up different crawler impact rules, which allow us to dial back how frequently SharePoint's going to keep hitting a particular site. We have the ability to set up different crawl rules, which allow us to utilize either a different algorithm or different username and password to connect out to a different site. That's actually separate from our content sources, so we can configure that as needed later on. The only two things that our content sources need to share, all the items inside of there, they just need to share the same location type and the same crawl schedule. Now we're going to notice that we've got a couple of very big options for our content sources. The first of which is going to be our different start addresses. Basically, hey, this is where our information is. We've got the different crawl settings. Now, this is going to vary slightly depending on the actual location type, but you're generally going to have two main options, where option one will give us the ability to just crawl that root folder. Option two will give us the ability to do a recursive crawl where it will search the parent and then all of the children. That's the default, and typically that's what you're going to be looking for. We also have the ability to set up our schedules, full and incremental, and we'll talk about that in an upcoming slide. And then finally, we have the ability to set up a content source priority to normal or high. And basically what this is going to tell SharePoint is that if two content sources are currently under schedule and SharePoint should be crawling both of them, which one gets priority? And obviously the one that gets marked as high is going to be the one that's going to get priority there. Now, as far as our crawl types and our crawl schedules go, we effectively have three options. The first option that we have is a full crawl. Now, sort of like the name implies, our full crawl is going to crawl everything. Now, a full crawl can be scheduled. And you might be wondering, well, why in the world would I ever want to schedule a full crawl? If that's going to crawl everything, and especially if you already know that we have an incremental crawl, why do we ever need to step back and do a full? Well, the reason that we need to step back and do a full is that unfortunately our incremental crawl doesn't necessarily pick up everything. So if we make certain behind the scenes changes, like adding on a brand new iFilter, modifying the username and password that's going to connect to a particular location, SharePoint Search isn't going to be able to detect those changes without doing a full crawl. So what some organizations like to do, just to make sure that they've got everything, is they like to go in and just schedule a full crawl, say like once a month or once every 6 months, sort of like a spring cleaning, if you will. I'm not necessarily a fan of that, because the different changes that we're talking about that are going to necessitate a full crawl, like adding in a brand new iFilter, those are going to be things that you're not going to be doing that frequently, if at all. And when you do go in and do that, you're going to find that it's something you're going to be fully aware of, that you're going to be doing some testing, you're going to be doing some planning, and you'll just schedule this whole thing to kick off over a weekend. So that way, when everybody comes back in on Monday morning, all of the data that's been impacted by that change will now have been crawled. So you can go in and schedule that. I'm personally not a big fan of it. The next type of crawl that we have available to us is an incremental crawl. And an incremental crawl, just like an incremental backup, is going to be all the changes since the last incremental. This is typically the one that you're going to schedule. Now, the frequency at which you schedule this is going to determine your latency. So in other words, if I only schedule this to kick off, say, once every 6 hours, well then, if a user makes a change, it's going to take 6 hours, or up to 6 hours, for that change to be reflected inside of the search results. Now, you're going to need to go in and determine what you want your crawl schedules to be here. You might decide for SharePoint that you want to be maybe a little bit more aggressive. Maybe you decide to do this every hour, let's say. And I'm sort of a fan of doing it like that because after all, your users are going to kind of expect, hey, I put something into SharePoint. It should appear inside of SharePoint Search pretty quickly. And I'm in agreement with them. You know, that seems to be very logical. But for things that are external to SharePoint, things that are maybe inside of Exchange or maybe inside of a file share, that your users are going to be a little bit more understanding if there's some degree of latency there that they put in an item and they might have to wait a few hours for that to then appear inside of SharePoint Search. So they might not be happy about it, but at least they'll understand it and they'll be willing to go along with that. You're going to have to adjust that based on your users' needs. Now, a brand new feature to SharePoint 2013 is a continuous crawl. And sort of like the name implies, this is going to be a continuous crawl, that what it's going to be doing is constantly on the lookout for changes. Anytime that it sees a change, it'll go ahead and crawl that item. This is one of those trade-off things. The nice part about this is that you're going to have little to no latency as far as changes and when they're going to appear inside of SharePoint Search. The problem, of course, is that there is going to be some overhead that will be incurred by this. So you'll need to adjust based on your team's needs as to which type of a crawl schedule you decide to go with. Let's get in and take a look at setting up a SharePoint content source. Now, what I'm going to do here is I'm going to create a very basic little folder here. And I'm going to call this shared. And I'm going to go ahead and set my permissions here. And what I'm going to do is I'm just going to share this out. And on my security, what I'm going to do is make sure that my 2013 service account has the ability to read that data, and that's all that it's going to need. Now, if you remember from before when we set up our SharePoint implementation, this was the account that I chose as my default crawl account. So that's the account that's going to need to have read access to this folder. So we just added that in. And now I'm going to go ahead and hit OK. And I'm going to hit close. So we've got our very basic little folder here that we've created. Let me go ahead and create a Word document. The beatings will continue until morale improves. Okay, and this is going to be our little HR document here. And let's go ahead and save that out to our shared directory. Okay, now we're going to use that document a little bit later, but basically what I wanted to show you here and why I actually filmed me creating a folder and creating a Word document is basically just kind of a, hey, look, nothing up my sleeves. I'm just creating a normal file share. Nothing at all that's fancy there. Okay, so with that set up, let's go ahead and fire up Central Administration. And I'm going to go to Manage Service Applications. And let me kick on over to my SharePoint search. Okay, now on the SharePoint search screen, there's a couple of things that I want to highlight right away here. The first thing that you're going to notice is the default content access account. And if I wanted to go in and change that, all I have to do is just hit that link and away we go. You'll notice the contact email for crawl, so that way if anything goes wrong, it can send off an email. You just go in and update that. And then you'll also notice information about our logging. Now, that little search alert status is kind of a neat feature that what this will allow us to do is it will allow your users to create an alert on a search, so that if a new item has been created that would fall under that search, the user will then get an email about that. So it's kind of a very nice way for them to almost just kind of create a virtual folder that they go off to a search, and anytime a brand new item falls into that, they're then going to get an alert on that. It is going to incur a bit of overhead, but it's generally speaking one of those things that's a good idea to implement. Now, what I'm going to do is I'm going to scroll down and highlight our search application topology. And this is a read-only UI where you can see all the different moving parts that we've got. So you'll notice the different databases down below. And then up towards the top, you can see all of the different components that we have and the server that's going to be running them. Now, in my case, I want to take a look at our content sources. So I'm just going to navigate on over to our content sources here. And you're going to notice that we automatically get local SharePoint sites here. And the big thing that I always like to point out about our local SharePoint sites here is that if I open this up, you're going to notice that it will automatically pick up all of our SharePoint web applications that we've created. And generally speaking, this will do a good job of picking up any brand new ones, but I do like to always just go back in and double check. So anytime that I create a brand new web application, I always like to make sure that it appears in here. Now you're also going to notice down below that we've got our scheduling, and it's a very good idea to go in and set up a schedule, or to go in and just simply say enable continuous crawl. So we'll just put the little dot right there, and we'll hit OK. And you'll notice my status of crawling continuously. And if you decide that you want to disable that, if you decide you want to go back and edit it, then all you have to do is just hit the drop down. So now let's go ahead and create our content source for our file shares. So I'm just going to give this a very clever name of file shares. I'm going to put my little dot next to file shares here. And we'll set up our location of whack SharePoint 2013, geektrainer.com/shared. And then let me scroll on down. You'll notice it'll ask me, do you want to search just that folder, or do you want to search that folder and subfolders? And that's the default and typically what we want. You'll notice we've got our incremental and our full crawl schedule. On the incremental, what I'm going to do is I'm just going to schedule this to go once a day. We'll just leave the little dot next to daily there and hit OK. And then I'm going to scroll on down and I'm going to hit OK. Now, at midnight, it's going to kick off an incremental, but we are going to need to have it do a full crawl as well. And so let me just hit the little drop down and we'll hit start full crawl to let it do its thing there. So that way, when we get into actually doing our demos where we'll retrieve items, that will actually have some data to look at. Okay, so that's running in the background. Let's go back over to the slides and pick up where we left off. Let's talk a little bit about crawl rules. A crawl rule gives us the ability to change the way that SharePoint is going to crawl a location. Now, this is done on a location-by-location basis rather than being done on a content source basis. So that way, I can still have everything wrapped up inside of my content sources, but still have the capability, still have the power to go back and control how we're actually going to crawl that data. Now, one of the other very big things, and it's quite powerful, is the ability to use regular expressions as well. Now, on our crawl rules, we've got a couple of different options here. We first of all have the ability just to exclude items. So that way, if there's something that we don't want crawled, maybe there's a site collection, maybe like for R&D or maybe for human resources, where we don't want that information to ever be searched. We just don't want it to ever appear. One of the ways that we can do this is just by going in and setting up a crawl rule and just telling it to exclude that location. And I will mention that it's a lot easier to exclude something than it is to go back and remove it later, because on the remove screen I basically just get a text box and that's it. So it's much easier not to let it in the first place. Just do that by setting up a crawl rule. You're also going to notice on the far right that we've got the ability to change the authentication mechanism. So if I need to provide a different username and password, maybe we've got a cookie that we want to use, maybe we're going to be using forms-based authentication, that I can provide those credentials that way. And then finally in the middle, you're going to notice that we have the ability to modify the way that we're going to actually crawl the items. So we have the ability, for example, to just follow the links. Let's say that we have a portal page. Let's say that we have a fact page where all that we have is just a series of links that actually point to the content behind the scenes. Well, one of the problems that you're going to wind up running into with search is that search may see that page, and it may see that that page is very popular. It may see that that page is being accessed quite heavily. It may see that that page has all the different keywords that a user has searched for, and it may return that very high up in the results set. So my user sees that, they click on it, and now they're just presented with yet another list of links, which when you get right down to it, that's what our search results are. They're just a list of links. That's not going to give our users the best experience. They're not really interested in the portal page, they're interested in the content behind that portal. So what we can do is we can tell it to just follow the links, but not actually crawl that particular page. You're also going to notice that we have the ability to tell our SharePoint crawler to crawl SharePoint content like HTTP pages. Normally, the way that the crawl service is going to work is it's just simply going to connect out to SharePoint, call a web service, and basically just ask SharePoint, hey SharePoint, what's going on? What you got? Give me all your items. And so SharePoint's just going to go ahead and reply with all the appropriate information. The catch here is I might be using SharePoint for publishing, which basically means that I'm going to be creating an internet site or maybe an intranet site that's going to be read-only and really much more of kind of a classic and what's going to appear to basically be a static environment that my users are going to click different links to get to different pages. Now, there might be certain pages that have been orphaned, certain pages that are maybe just dev pages that haven't actually been published out yet that we don't want appearing anywhere. So what we can do is we can tell our crawler, this site, don't just simply call SharePoint Web Services and say, hey, what do you have available? Instead, pretend to be a normal client. So what it will do is it will just simply follow all the links. And if it doesn't find a link to a particular item, it's not going to see that item. So unless a user could actually access it by hitting a link, it's not going to actually be crawled and thus not actually show up in the search results. Now, the last big thing that we can set inside of there is how we want to handle complex URLs. Complex URLs are any URL with a query string. Basically, if you see a question mark in there, that's a query string. Now, query strings can be used for a lot of different reasons. A couple of the most common ones are session tokens and item IDs. One of the things about HTTP is that it's stateless, meaning that we make a request, the server's going to build up the response, send it out the door, and away we go from there. Once it sends it back to us, it's going to disconnect and it's going to forget who we are, and so it makes it very difficult to create an application that's going to require multiple round trips. This is where session management comes into play, and there's a lot of different ways to manage sessions. One of the ways is just to generate an ID and always have that in the URL. So that way, every time you hit a link, that URL will contain the ID for my session. The problem here is that every time that we hit a page as part of a new session, that ID is going to change even though the actual contents of the page are the same. So it's a different URL, but the pages are really the same. The way that SharePoint is going to treat this by default is it's just simply going to store one version of the page. So rather than storing a separate version for each value that it happens to find inside of there, it's just going to store one version, which in the case of a session ID is perfect. But another reason that somebody might be using a query string is for an item ID, a product ID, for example. And the reason that they might be doing this is that then that way the URL will always point back to the product page for our widget. The basic goal here is so then that way we can take that URL and we could send that off to a friend, they hit that link, and they'll always be able to pull that up. Okay, that's cool. But SharePoint, again, by default, every time that it sees a different ID inside of there, it's just going to store one version of the page. So what I can do is I can tell it, no. For this, what I want you to do is I want you to store different versions based on that URL. So let's go in and take a look at how we could configure that. Back to central administration. Our service applications, SharePoint search, and let's set up our crawl rules. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to add in a brand new crawl rule, and let's say that we've got http:// public geektrainer.com/AdventureWorks bikes products ASPX. That's the page that we use to display all of our different product information. So what I want to do is I just want to tell it, hey, look, I want you to store multiple values there. So we'll just put the little dot next to include. We'll put a little check next to crawl complex URLs. And then if there was anything else that we needed to configure, we can choose the appropriate options. And then just simply hit OK. And now we've added in that little rule. Now, one of the things that I want to mention here in closing is that the SharePoint crawl service is not just simply going to start throwing values at the product ID or anything like that. It's just simply going to do it naturally so that as it finds different values there, it's just going to store different versions of the page. Next up is our server name mappings. Our crawler is basically just going to act like a client. So we want to make sure that it's able to contact the server with the information as quickly as possible. So one of the ways that you're typically going to do this is by using some form of an internal name. That typically you're going to have a public network that all your users are going to access, and then you're going to have a private network that your servers can use to communicate with one another. When you're setting up your crawl locations, you typically want to use the internal names, but your users aren't going to be able to resolve those names. That's where server name mappings come into play. Basically, what you're going to do is you're just going to tell the SharePoint search service, hey, if you see this URL, if that's what you crawled, this is really the one that you want to display out to the outside world. And setting this up is just this straightforward. Let's take a look at setting up a server name mapping. I'm going to go back to Central Administration, Manage Service Applications, our search service, and our server name mappings. And this is really very straightforward. You just hit New Mapping, whatever the internal name happen to be, HTTP:// internal, and then whatever it is that I want to expose outside, so HTTP:// intranet, for example. And then hit OK, and that's it. So whenever it sees internal, it's automatically going to replace that with intranet. Now, one of the other options that we have the ability to do is to add in brand new file types. And you'll notice inside of the SharePoint Search Admin tool that there is the ability to add in file types. And all that you would have to do is to simply click Add and type in the extension, and away you go. Now, the one big thing that this doesn't do is this does not set up iFilters automatically for you. That is still your responsibility. So you'll have to install the iFilter onto the content processor so that way it can actually bust the file open and do its work. That little screen inside of Central Administration isn't going to do it for you. Now, one of the very big things about installing a brand new iFilter is that it does require a full crawl. Oh, by the way, brand new little feature here is the fact that we have a PDF iFilter already built in. For those of you who are familiar with previous versions of SharePoint, you might remember that was the big one that we didn't get automatically. That is now built in. The SharePoint crawler service, well, quite frankly, it can be a little bit of a jerk. It can really wind up pushing servers beyond their means. It's only interested in itself. That if you tell it, hey, I want you to go crawl that, by golly, it's going to go crawl that location as hard as it possibly can. And unfortunately, that can wind up slowing down the environment that I'm trying to crawl. This is where my crawler impact rules come into play. My crawler impact rules allow me to limit the impact of crawling, and I can do this in one of two ways. Either A, I can limit the number of concurrent requests, or B, what I can do is I can tell it to do one request at a time and then pause between each request. Let's say, for example, that I was crawling maybe a public-facing site. I can do this by setting up a rule. How would this look? Well, it would look a little bit like this. I'm going to go back to Central Administration, go back to my service applications, go back to SharePoint Search, go to my crawler impact rules, and then I can add in a brand new rule. And what you'll notice is that it'll ask me for the name of the site without protocol, so just simply public.geektrainer.com, and then I just put my little dot next to request, one document at a time, and say 5 seconds. And when I hit OK, it'll save this rule. Now, the one big thing, of course, to keep in mind is that if you do decide to set up a crawler impact rule, that this is obviously going to lengthen the amount of time that it takes to do a crawl. Two last little items that are worth highlighting in that section are my index reset and my pause resume. Pause resume will do exactly that. It'll just pause the search service, maybe for maintenance purposes, and then give me the ability to resume it. And then my index reset, just like it would imply, is going to reset the entire index. Now, this is obviously not something I'm wanting to do on production, but this is something that might be very helpful for testing. That maybe I go off, I start playing around with some rules, and now I'm ready to go live with it. So maybe I had some test data, I just want to go ahead and get rid of it, and let's just start all over. That can be a very easy way for me to do this. Once SharePoint Search has been deployed, It's then time to turn our attention to actually monitoring it. And fortunately, SharePoint gives us a lot of great reports that we can use to monitor SharePoint search. The first big one that we have is the crawl log. What the crawl log will do for us is it will give us the ability to basically see everything that happened with crawls. Basically, this is your number one troubleshooting tool for whenever a user calls you up and says, hey, I can't find an item. Assuming that the item exists, assuming that they have permissions, then it's going to show up inside the results. If it doesn't, chances are it wasn't crawled. So the easiest way for me to track this down is by using the crawl log. And you'll notice that the crawl log gives us a lot of great views. So we can see the history, we can see our errors, we can see information on a database by database basis, and we can also go in and look for individual items with a URL view. Let's take a look at how we could use the crawl log to find out whether or not an item was indexed. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go back to Central Administration, and again to our Service Applications, and again to SharePoint Search. And I'm going to hit my crawl log. Now, as I mentioned, we've got a lot of different views for our crawl log. I want the URL view. So I'm just going to choose URL view. And then inside of here, I can just type in the URL that I'm interested in. So I'm looking for the file share on SharePoint2013.geektrainer.com. So I go ahead and I say file, whack, whack, SharePoint2013.geektrainer.com. And I'm going to click search. And now what you're going to notice is that this will give me information about everything that it found inside of that environment. So it shows us that it crawled the shared folder, and it shows us that it crawled the individual item. Now, what's really cool about the individual item is that we've got the ability to open it up. We've got the ability to force it to recrawl that item the next time that it goes to crawl that location. And then last but not least is to remove the item from the index. So again, the user ever calls you up and says, hey, I can't find something, that's the easiest way to track that down. Now, if you're looking for a lot more kind of rolled up information, SharePoint offers an awful lot of reports. For example, we've got different crawl health reports, and the big thing that this is going to give us is information about our crawls. So things like the rate, things like the freshness, things like the CPU and memory load, so that way we can adjust our components and adjust our memory, adjust our network throughput as needed. We also have our query health reports, and this is going to give us information about how our queries are being executed, about the throughput and performance of our queries. We're also going to get a lot of great usage reports. Now, on our usage reports, this is where I get to find out, sort of like the name implies, how my users are actually utilizing SharePoint Search. SharePoint Search is not a set it and forget it service. Then I need to monitor and analyze how my users are using search, so that way I can make sure that my users are very easily able to find the information that they are looking for. Now, inside of our usage queries are a couple of very important reports. We have our abandoned queries reports. Now, our abandoned queries basically means that a user did a search and they didn't click on anything. Now, quite frequently, that's because they saw way too many links and whatever it was that they were looking for didn't show up right away. And one of the things that we're going to see is that we can go in and create different rules to help drive that, to help make sure that when a user does a search for a common term, maybe like vacation, that we can make sure that the items that they were probably looking for, the vacation request form, the vacation policy, pop up towards or at the very top of the list. Our no result queries, which are going to tell us that a user did a search and it didn't give back any items. And quite frequently, this could be maybe typos, Or this could also be that they're using different abbreviations or different acronyms that are very common to them, but don't actually appear anywhere inside the index. And again, we can modify this by using rules. That what I could do is I could set up a rule where I say, well, if I see this, replace it instead with this query. And then finally, last but not least, is our query rule usage. And that's going to tell us how heavily our rules are actually being utilized. Now, a lot of that has to go in with modifying the user experience and setting up all of our rules. We're going to see that in the next lesson. And I'll see you guys in the next lesson.